I know that already the people here, the poets here, they talked about their poetry. I'm not reading my poems. I'm just talking about the behind the prose poem. I read an article where the line breaks the freedom of the prose poem. That's the title of the article. We are living in a poetic age now. Basically, what we read at the moment in books, in newspapers, on webs, on social media, and in text messages is all written in prose. When particular among them is a novel, which is the most popular and typically written in it. However, today a considerable number of people still prefer poems in typical poetic forms to express their feelings and emotions, especially with regard to greeting cards or romantic stuff. On the other hand, there is another form, the prose poem in poetry, a bit away from typical forms, which was introduced to us long ago. Though not having as much attractive or popularity as the typical poetic forms, it also plays an important role in providing poets with more various different ways to express their thoughts and makes them even more comfortable. Is compared to typical forms in poetry. As a prose poem, there are no strict fixed rules relating to the length of the lines, rhythms, and system of rhymes and repeat. It should have a story behind a sentence, a song behind a tale, a melody behind a word, etc. In particular, there should be a poetic flavor which should take priority over a poetic form. Even though prose poetry has existed for almost 200 years, it is still hard to define clearly. Many readers do not trust it and think it is just prose, pretending to be a poetry. Written by people who cannot use rhyme or rhythm properly. People once said similar things about free verse poetry too. Thus, I already explained like free verse and then prose poem. But the history of literature shows that poetry has never stayed fixed in one form or structures. When poet Charles Simic received the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1990, the many conservative readers were surprised. How could a form they refused to acknowledge as poetry receive one of literature's highest honors? Russell Edson's observation seems fitting here. A cast iron airplane that can actually fly mainly because its pilot does not seem to care whether it does or not. Simic once remarked that he never sat down intending to write prose poems, rather poems comes to him naturally. Poetry perhaps should be exactly that, something that compels that poet to write. He revised tirelessly, crossing out words and rearranging lines repeatedly until they found their proper place. Years later, fragments left in his notebooks could themselves become entirely new poems. Now, like Jivananda Das, so he was born in 1999 in Bangladesh. So I'm talking about him a little bit. Like Jivananda Das in Bengali literature, Simic understood the power of words. Das waited months for the right expressions, transforming neglected words into powerful images and emotional landscapes. The poetry is not simply language, it is the shaping of experience through exactness and imagination. Prose poetry is renowned from of writing. It does not mainly focus on telling a story step by step, in time order. Instead, it focuses on creating a strong feeling of the present moment. Jonathan Kuller, when talking about the traditional lyric poetry, called this is the present time of discourse. This kind of writing often has a ritual-like and exaggerated emotional quality. We should also remember that in prose poetry, the style of prose is used differently from normal novels or non-fiction writing. In good prose poetry, prose is not just used to tell information or clear story. Instead, it's used to create emotion, imagery, and poetic effect. If we go back to the innovation of French romantic prose poets such as Baudelaire, and have been transformed French and international poetry, so their innovative idea of prose poetry remain a form of poetry despite its construction in sentences and paragraphs. The tendency for this form of poetry is challenge or strengthen our assumption about the poetic penetrates further than perhaps any of us had previously imagined. In prose poems, we often find the voice of an author mixed with the voices of characters or other, sometimes extextual or historical voices or contemporary reference in a way that create a sense of an unsettled whole or whole composed of disparate, disjunctive, and sometimes the fragment parts. In a sentence, what is the prose poetry we must say? Verse-free poetic expressions where there is no line break. If we go back to history of prose poetry, when we found so many poets try to write prose poetry in many aspects, such as American poet Amy Lowell's Bath, the Russell Edson's Metals, and David Ingstow's Information, and Henriette Mullen's Kilsberg Said. Sorting. I'm just reading the Amy Lowell, 1915 to 1917. In the meantime, so he wrote the Bath poem. The day is fresh, washed and fair. There is a smell of tulip narcissus in the air. The sunshine pours in the bathroom window and pours through the water in the bathtub in lattice and plains of greenish white. It clips the water into flows like a jewel and cracks into bright light. So 1915 or 1917, that time, so he wrote the prose poem, the straight line. That was very wonderful. And the Russell Edson also wrote the Metal 1960 to 1968 in between, the prose poem. So over the last few months, I have had a very rich and meaningful reading experience with the prose poetry of Amy Lowell, Russell Edson, Edgar Allan Poe, T.S. Eliot, and Andrew Motion, and Gene Sparkland. You know the Andrew Motion and Gene Sparkland in this country. So prose poem exact in a flexible space between poetry and prose. They give writers the freedom to use old sentences without worrying about line breaks. All the same time, they still use the poetic tools like images, sounds, symbols, and unusual sentence patterns that we often find in poetry. If we go further to the West, we included more poets who started first English prose poetry, such as Irishman Oscar Wilde, American fellow Walter Whitman, Allan Poe, and so on. By the mid-20th century, prose poetry enjoyed a revival in the USA, while poets like William S. Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, Charles Simic, Robert Bly, Harriet Mullen, Russell Edson, as someone wrote some sort of or long prose-based poetry. One interesting explanation about the prose poem I found, in the first issue of the Prose Poem, an international journal, editor Peter Johnson, he said, the prose poem, just as black humor straddles the fine line between comedy and tragedy. So the prose poem plants one foot in prose, the other in poetry. So both hills resting periculously on banana peels. In conclusion, I'm going to finish here. In conclusion, the prose and poem are two commonly used forms of literature with different meanings and writing styles. The actual difference between the proses and the poetry is that the former is written in complex and in paragraphs. On the contrary, a poem is written in stanzas with aesthetic style. Furthermore, prose consists of no rhymes or rhythm, unlike the poem, which has unique pattern. Thank you very much.